Hello everyone, welcome to Lab 8, Intelligence and Psychological Testing Part 2. So, starting from this week, we're going to move on to online instructions. And for this week, there will just be a video, but for next week, probably we're going to start to use WebEx, which is, I assume that you might be familiar with WebEx. That is a conference call software for everyone to meet with each other virtually online. So, we have already talked about the history of intelligence tests and the components of modern intelligence testing last week. This week, we're going to learn more about issues in intelligence tests and the importance of different kinds of intelligence. As many of you may notice that there are many issues and controversies surrounding the concept of intelligence and intelligence testing. So, today we're going to go through each of those issues, including the stability of IQ, the extreme values, the influences on intelligence, and the bias in testing. So the first question that we want to focus on today is whether a person's IQ is stable. So as you can see from this graph, since age 1 to age probably 10 or 11, a child or a infant or toddler's IQ has been dramatically increased. So IQ scores are unstable during this period because that's I would say the most significant developmental period for intelligence exploring and also for brain development. However, after age 12, a person's IQ score became relatively stable. To further examine the stability of IQ, researchers has divided IQ score into 4 different components. So 2 major types. First one is crystallized IQ, and the second one is the fluid intelligence. The crystallized intelligence continues to increase throughout adulthood because it's based on the education and experience. As you can see from this graph, the numeric ability and the verbal ability keep increasing until the age of 53. So that's well, we will say that 65 years old will be considered as an older adult, but at the age of 53, a person might start to lower their memory abilities or other kinds of abilities. So that's when your crystallized intelligence start to be stable. However, again, crystallized intelligence continues to increase. Different from crystallized intelligence, the fluid intelligence will begin to decline in middle adulthood. When they say middle adulthood, but according to this graph, we can see that ever since age 25 years old, your fluid intelligence is just going to decrease, which is a natural process that we cannot go against it, but it's fine because fluid intelligence are just skills that are based on problem-solving abilities and abstract thinking, such as spatial orientation, processing speed. Remember when we talk about the video game players who retired at age 25, that is because their processing speed or their responding speed are just getting slowed at that time. They cannot compete with those 16-year-old new players. So, the second issue surrounding the intelligence test is the extremes of intelligence. Again, we got this very familiar normal distribution curve of IQ test. As we can see here, again, 100 is the 50 percentile, which is also the mean and the median, which means that you are above or similar to 50% of the population when talking about your IQ if you got a 100 point. But for those who are above or below 2 standard deviation from the mean, in this case, the 2 standard deviation represents 130 and 70. So if you are beyond or below 2 standard deviations from the mean, which means your at the end of extreme scores, IQ 70 or below, or 135 or above. However, having a extreme low IQ does not represent that you have any kind of intelligence disability, because intelligence disability must include 3 diagnostic criteria. So the first one is that the onset of intelligence disability is prior to adulthood. And the second one is that IQ has to be below approximately 70. And when IQ standard change by even few points, there might be a severe results. So if we raised up the standard for intelligence disability to 75 points, that will double the children in the special education. So the third diagnostic criteria for intelligence disability is that children must have inadequate adaptive skills, as assessed by difficulties with dressing and feeding oneself, communicating with others, and managing other basic life skills. About 2/3 of children with intelligence disability lose this diagnosis in adulthood, because by the time they're grown up, they will be able to acquire life functioning skills. They're able to communicate with others, or they were able to feed themselves and dress themselves. So they are no longer qualified for the intelligence disability diagnosis. So here is a intelligence disability diagnostic criteria, as I have already talked about. So the problem here is the practical skills, such as cooking and shopping, is that there is not a good measure or good method to measure the everyday living skills. This is a challenge for future researchers. And as we can see that there are 4 levels of intellectual disability: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. And 85% of children who have been diagnosed with intelligence disability fell into the mild category. So we have talked about the lower extremes, and now we're gonna talk about the higher extremes, the giftedness. So there are 2 separate definitions of giftedness. For expert, giftedness should not be solely identified by IQ scores. However, school typically used minimum IQ of 130 as a standard for gifted programs. I guess the reason for schools to do that is it will be easier for them to, and it's more standardized for them to just pick children based on their IQ scores, rather than considering other special skills. So there are 2 groups of giftedness based on these 2 kinds of definitions. So the first kind of giftedness is the high IQ children, who are at top of their class in school, who have like special education in a different way. And the second type of giftedness are adults who make major contributions to their field, which depends on the intersection of high intelligence, high creativity, and high motivation. For children who have high IQ and were gifted, they may not necessarily to grown up as a gifted adult, and that's pretty obvious. So remember this guy, this Terman, we have talked about last week, who is the chairman of Stanford University Psych Department, and also the president of APA Association, American Psychology Association. Terman did a longitudinal study, tracked 1,500 junior high students with giftedness, with IQ above 135, and followed them for decades. They find a much higher rate of graduate degrees in this group compared to general population. However, as you guys may remember that from last week, I have talked about 1 or 2 of the major drawbacks of this longitudinal study. The first one is that Terman only picked non-Hispanic white male students, probably not male, but white students. And the second one is that Thurman wrote letter of recommendations for those students. And we all know that a letter of recommendation from a Stanford professor, a distinguished professor, is very impactful for one's career or academic development. So, the debate between nature versus nurture was started from Sir Galton, the pioneer of intelligence testing, and the debate is still currently ongoing because there are always some people believe that nature is more important, whereas the others may believe in environment factors. So here is a visualized table about the similarity of intelligence scores. As we can see here, the identical twins who reared together have the highest correlation between their IQ scores, and the unrelated individuals reared together has the lowest correlation, which just make a lot of sense. And studies of twins, family members, and adopted children together support the idea that there is a significant genetic contribution to intelligence. Study also shows that there is an effect of intelligence as well, because as we can see that identical twins who reared apart have different IQs compared to those who reared together. Another important area of research on genetic influences is the adoption studies. So, the logic is, if adopted children resemble their biological parents in IQ even though they were reared apart, which will support that IQ is heritable. So, research did show significant correlation between IQs of children and their biological parents, which support the nature perspective. So, here are two famous adoption studies. The first one is the Minnesota adoption study, which find that children from low socioeconomic background adopted into high socioeconomic families will perform better academically than children who raised in low socioeconomic backgrounds with same race. So this is a study conducted in 1976, which included 130 African American kids and interracial children who were adopted at around 18th month into wealthy Caucasian families. Several years later, they figured out that those adopted children have IQ scores about one standard deviation above their peers who have the same race as them. So the Minnesota adoption study is actually a evidence to support the nurture perspective. However, the Texas adoption study, which was designed for to test whether adopted children will have the similar IQ compared to their adoptive parents who reared them from birth. So the Texas adoption study was also designed to support the nurture perspective. However, they figured out that it was not the case. So in this Texas adoption study, there are about 300 families in Texas with adopted children, and most of these children were born in the 60s from churches with unmarried birth mothers. So both birth and adoptive families were largely Caucasian and middle class, and the birth mothers and adoptive parents will all gave IQ tests. And they figure out that the IQ of the children is more highly correlated with birth mother compared to adopted parents. However, this finding that support nature perspective may be confounded by the role of maternal fetal environment. Before we were born, our brain structure developed in mother's utero. That means, if your mother drink alcohol and use substance or have some severe injuries during the pregnancy period, probably your IQ will be highly impacted, which is not related to the genes. As we can see from this table, that the birth mother with adopted child has the highest correlation, range from 0.26 to 0.78, while the adopted mother with adopted children has the lowest IQ correlation, 0.02. Oh my god, it's so low. As we just mentioned, that the role of maternal fetal environment has been ignored by past researchers, and they finally find that the effect of genetics that many researchers find on IQ scores are actually confounded by the maternal fetal environment. As we can see here, the structure formation of the central nervous system happened when we were still in our mother's utero, and every minute, more than 250,000 brain cells are created. Appearance of adult brain will appear by 40 weeks gestation, which means the maternal fetal environment actually got counted off for our brain development and IQ scores. So, after talking about the nature effect, now we're gonna move on to nurture effect. As we haven't talked about that in last week's lecture, that intelligence tests are gonna be re-standardized every 10 to 15 years or so. Remember that the WAIS 4 has been widely adopted as the most popular intelligence test, but in 2021, the WAIS 5 will be published. And the reason the researchers and the scholars will keep updating the intelligence test and keep updating and keep re-standardizing the intelligence scores is that IQ has been increased over generations. As we can see from this table, from this chart, that based on 1996 standards, the average IQ score in 2020 is just 75, which is at the lower extreme, probably. It's a little bit above the lower extreme. It scores 70, but still it's a pretty low score. Whereas in 1990, the average intelligence test performance will be 100. So basically, this means that a person who has been perceived as normal back in 2020 will probably be able to be diagnosed with intelligence disability if they show 2 other symptoms, but still their IQ scores may probably just be 70. So, best evidence of the Flynn effect, which is the nurture effect, came from Europe and Japan. After the World War II, Japan and Europe's intelligence has been dramatically increased in those past few decades. And let's consider about the reasons for the increase of IQ scores worldwide. So, what are the factors that contribute to the increase of IQ? First of all, it cannot be the genetic effect, as we know that the genetic development or the evolvement of human being may take at least 100 years or 200 years so that the genes will be modified. but that's a very conservative prediction. Probably the gene development may take more than 100 or 200 years. So it cannot be gene, it cannot be a genetic effect. The effects has to come from environmental factors. And the most important three factors here are technology, parenting, and nutrition. So first, nutrition. The increase of nutrition contributes to not only the development of intelligence, but also the development of height, weight. Well, weight might be a side effect that is related to obese problem, but all other effect of nutrition, I would say, would be great. For example, the average height of teenagers has been dramatically increased, and the social development is also related to nutrition, because nutrition is related to brain development. Something else about nutrition is that it's about average life expectancy. So people who eat better, have getting more nutrition, we're gonna live longer, which is quite intuitive. And the second factor that contributes to the increase of IQ scores is parenting styles. Although we all know that mothers and fathers are very important for a person, the actual parenting skills and the parenting technologies were developed during the past few decades. So by that time, that's when the parents were start to learn about like how to be a good parent. And the third factor is the technology. Before we have no computer, we cannot do online learning if we have coronavirus back then. But now as you can see that we have this access to libraries, we have online libraries, we have access to online learning, we have access to everything that past children would be unable to enjoy, which will definitely contribute to the increase of IQ. So there are several major hypotheses from a neutral perspective. And one of the most important hypotheses is the commutative deprivation hypothesis. It's saying that if environment affects intelligence, children raised in a substandard circumstances should show gradually decline in IQ with age. And this hypothesis has been supported by studies of impoverished children and understaffed orphanages. Another hypothesis is that adopted children will score higher on IQ tests than their siblings or peers who has been left behind in disadvantaged circumstances. However, research on these hypotheses has inconclusive results or mixed results, and some of them do find this increase of IQ, but some of them do not find this increase of IQ among adopted children. And one potential reason for this inconclusive result is that there might probably be a sensitive period or a critical period for a children to develop their IQ. So for example, if a children was adopted by the age of 3 months, his or her IQ will not be influenced by that deprived environment. However, if a child was adopted by the age of 16, so if you're already 16 years old, even if you're adopted to a wealthy family, this will the higher socioeconomic background will not be that supportive for you to develop your IQ. So that's why the result seems to be dependent on like how long adopted children were in previous circumstances. All of these neutral perspective experiment shows that IQ is not unchangeable. It's sensitive to environment. So, nurture and nurture, they're actually not that conflict. So to combine them together, we got the reaction range model. That means the heredity sets limits on intelligence, and the environment determines where individuals fall within limits. which means if you have a high quality environment, the children's IQ will near the top of the potential range that he or she can have based on his or her genetic components. And if a child is in a low quality environment, his or her IQ will near the bottom of the range based on their genetic component. So this reaction range model explains why some high IQ kids come from the low quality environment and vice versa. Research has suggested that the heritability of IQ is about 50% of influence. So basically it's saying that both nature and nurture are very significant for one's IQ development. So let's move on to another issue surrounding current intelligence testing, which is culture and IQ. As we can see that full range of IQ scores were found in all ethnic groups. However, larger racial minority groups in the US score an average of 10 to 15 points lower than whites. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think there's a gap? Voter ID laws make it also difficult for racial minorities to vote for the candidates who could potentially act on their behalf. For example, I'm not sure if it's true, but I think it's true that people in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is a part of the U.S. However, people in Puerto Rico do not have the right to vote for president. Here we list a lot of factors that is associated with lower socioeconomic status, which is associated with social injustice. Lower socioeconomic status is related to larger families, single-parent homes, fewer books, learning supplies, poor quality schools, and so on. So, like all negative impacts. That is different from genes, so that some people may say that there is a genetic difference between different races, and that's why there is intelligence difference. But they just ignore that. They just ignore the exist of institutional racism and all other forms of social injustice. Another factors that contribute to differences in IQ scores are related to the bias during the test. For example, some of the individual items in the test were more difficult than others for individuals from different culture groups or social groups. Remember the picture completion task we have did last week, that there is no snow on the log one. Well, I come from an area where we don't have snow there, just no snow. So it will be very difficult for me to identify that, there should be snow there. No, I don't know. I don't know whether that will impact, but probably there are some cultural differences in those cases. Meanwhile, the intelligence test is based a lot upon the language skill, as we have talked about. So it has like literacy dependent. It is middle class oriented. And the standardized procedure, remember that the standardized procedure required a researcher to collect data from a representative sample of the population. By representative sample of the population in the US, which means at least half of the participants must be white, because they composed of like 60% of the total population in the US. So to generate a representative population, which is basically another way of saying that generate a majority populations scores. So the standardized procedure of IQ test is actually a way of getting majority white intelligence score. Another effect is that the IQ test is also related to the language, as we have talked about last week. So in Spanish-speaking populations, translations between English and Spanish versions are unreliable. So individuals who live in the US and speak Spanish and limited English may still need to be tested in English, which will influence their scores. And different cultures also have different attitudes to testing. So for example, some cultures do not focus on time testing, which is very important in ways. Another important concept in test taking is the stereotypes threat, which means there are negative stereotypes of stigmatized groups, which create the feelings of vulnerability in the classroom, and this stereotype threat can undermine their test performance. So this is a concept not just for intelligence tests, but actually for all kinds of tests that you can think of. If an individual believes that he or she or her racial ethnicity group will do poorly in the test, others will attribute their failure to their racial or gender category. Such kind of anxiety will undermine the investment in academic work, will also make them be more anxious and anxiety during the test taking period, which will definitely influence their performance. So the good news is the group differences has been decreased over time, which probably will be contributed to the people's awareness of institutionalized racism. And I think people now are beginning to looking for social justice, so that the change of society and economics and politics will affect social norms and children's development. Well, I don't know if that will still be the case, since we now have the President Trump, who just called coronavirus the China virus. But well, that's a optimistic hope. So group differences will also disappear when you statistically control for education, occupation, income, and region. So again, this suggests that the differences between IQs among different racial ethnicity groups are actually based on the differences in their socioeconomic status and educational occupational opportunities. So these gaps in IQ are not due to genetic differences, although some may argue that they have. So the bell curve is a book published by an author who claimed that there are genetic differences between some race minority groups and the whites. Well, we as psychology researchers do not agree with. So we have talked a lot about what is intelligence and how do we test intelligence, but we haven't talked about what is the importance of intelligence. Why do we care? So, job performance, academic achievement are the two major outcomes that people are looking for. We're also going to talk about different types of intelligence. I think you might be familiar with IQ versus EQ or so on so. And besides intelligence, there are also other factors to consider, as we have talked about socioeconomic status, educational background, and a lot of environmental factors. using IQ as a predictor for job performance. Researchers find that the correlation is about 0.5. 0.5 is a moderate correlation, which means that job IQ accounts for about 25% of the variance in job performance. You may say that it's a fair impact, but there are other factors that is related to your job performance. Also, when the jobs get getting more complicated, the IQ becomes a better predictor of performance, which is quite intuitive. And IQ is also a better predictor of success in job training programs than of the actual job performance. Which also makes sense because in real life, the actual job performance will be determined by a lot of different issues, such as whether you have a bad boss or your clients are in a bad mood. Like all of those, just factors that will all influence your job performance. Sometimes even your luck, I think, probably will count for I don't know how much percent of variance, but it will definitely, influence your achievement in both academic and real life career. IQ has been also used to predict the academic achievement, and the results will depend on the age group studied. So, for adolescents and children, the correlation between IQ and academic achievement is about 0.5. For adults, the correlation is actually 0.6 to 0.8. But for college students, the correlation is typically lower. Why do you think that's the case? So, the first reason is that those with extremely low or otherwise IQ will not be able to get into college. So college itself is a way to just restrict the IQ range. Meanwhile, the grading systems in college is a categorical variable, A, B, C, D, which is unreliable. And GPA is also influenced by a wider amount of factors, such as if you have a lot of conferences to go during a semester, you might not be able to just, achieve the good grades. Also, like when I was an undergrad, I didn't study during my freshman and sophomore years. I don't even read the emails from my professors. So I really appreciate that you guys read emails and even watch this video. Cause if I were you when I was 18 years old, I don't even watch those videos recorded by my professors. Thank you, appreciate it. But that doesn't mean that. So I have low GPA when I was an undergrad, when I was a freshman or a sophomore. But it doesn't represent that I have low IQ. I don't think I have a low IQ. So probably that's why GPA in college is not, or is just moderately or not that strongly correlated with IQ. And besides the general IQ, the G, and the specific aspect of the general G, other people also created the different theories of IQ, including the triadic model. The triadic model is under the idea of multiple intelligences, proposed by Sternberg, who is a big name, that there is more intelligence than just G, the general G. There are three mostly distinct intelligences. The first one is the analytical intelligence, which refers to the ability to reason logically. So any kind of intelligence that serves us well on traditional IQ test and college admission test will be categorized as analytical intelligence. Analytical intelligence is closely related to general intelligence, but it is only one component, and according to the Sternberg, it's not the most important component in this triadic model. However, this component, this analytical intelligence, is the one most usually measured and attributed as intelligence. The second kind of the intelligence is the practical intelligence, or tactic intelligence. Its ability to solve the real-world problems, and the kind of intelligence we use in social situations to evaluate people and circumstances. So this is the street smart. And the creative intelligence is the ability to come up with novel and effective answers to questions when it's needed for new solutions to problems. According to Sternberg, the practical and creative intelligence are better predictors of things like job performance than analytical intelligence. So, however, there are still some problems in this triadic model, as we can see that there are overlaps between different kinds of intelligence. So the practical intelligence is not independent of the general G, which is the analytical intelligence. Because we always need some analytical intelligence to function in real world as street smart. Thus, since there are overlaps, and one they may have confounding effect because of such overlaps, it will be difficult for us to draw causal inferences to capture the causal relationship between the intelligence and job performance, as we cannot isolate it like one kind of intelligence. Here is another kind of intelligence that was not included in Sternberg's triadic model, but it's also very important, which is the emotional intelligence. It is the ability to monitor one's own or others' feelings and emotions and to discriminate among them, to use this information to guide one's thinking and actions. Emotional intelligence is very important, and I'm not sure if it's across culturally important, but at least in China, my parents always told me, I don't care about your IQ, you have to have a high EQ to succeed in our society. Because interpersonal relationship is what we most care about there. Finally, there are other factors that we would like to consider regarding the success or the academic performance and job performance. So the first one is the grit. So I recommend you to open this 6-minute TED Talk, which is super interesting and encouraging, and she's a much better presenter than me. So grit is probably more important or less important than intelligence. I think you might have your own answer. If we're in a class, I may have you guys to have a group discussion and come up with some comments. However, considering it's just a virtual presentation, you just think about it yourself. Okay, we will complete the IPIP NEO simulation and quizzing lab, so nothing is due next week. I will see you virtually next week.